Welcome to the Empowered Homes podcast. The purpose of this podcast is to be a resource to connect church and home by growing strong families.
This is Bobby Cooley, and today's show, we are going to be interviewing Brad Watson. Brad Watson is an author and contributor to SaturateTheWorld.com. He is a gospel-centered, gospel-focused, great thinker, and we're going to be talking about the gospel and your family and how to have hard conversations with those in your church. We're going to be talking about what does it look like to live out the gospel with your family and in your community. Brad serves as the equipping leader at Soma Culver City in Los Angeles, where he develops and teaches leaders to form communities to love God and serve the city. He's the author of multiple books, including Sent Together, How the Gospel Sends Leaders to Start Missional Communities. Holds a degree in theology from Western Seminary. Brad is a great friend, thinker, and just a guy that I appreciate so much. He's helped me understand and live out the gospel every day, and has an incredible impact on me as a leader and as a pastor. So, Brad, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Bobby.
Yeah, Brad, you want to share a little bit about yourself and your family?
Sure. Yeah. So all those things you said are true about me. I'm married to Mirella. She's a wonderful lady. She's quite a hero and partner in everything that we do. She's great. And we have 3 children. We live in the south side of Los Angeles, which is a really beautiful, vibrant, kind of crazy part of the city, part of the world. And I work for Saturate the World, which is a resourcing entity that helps equip the church to live everyday mission with gospel intentionality, making disciples who make disciples, all that good stuff. And I host a podcast called the Saturate Podcast. So if you're ever interested in diving way deep into any of those things in missional communities or gospel fluency, any of these cool buzzwords, you can check out that podcast. So
yeah, the podcast.
That's a bit about me.
What's the title of the podcast?
The Saturate Podcast.
Just the Saturate Podcast. It's so good. I listen to every new episode. It's incredible and just challenging how to live the gospel daily, not just a one-time, once a week thing. And that's, why I love you. I love, just your wisdom with the gospel of making it an everyday thing, and why I wanted you to talk to our parents and our families. What does it look like, and how do we kind of shape our families or reorient our families around the gospel so that it's not just something that we put on the calendar, but it's part of our DNA, our lifeblood as a family, as we grow together. And that's why I wanted you on the show. And, my first question out the gate, which is a super easy answer / not, but so what is the gospel? We talk about it, we use the word, we say it over and over, but what if you had me on the elevator for a few minutes, the whole elevator pitch, what is the gospel?
Yeah, that's a great question. That normally is asked at different points in elevators or sidewalks or things like that. Usually people want to know the difference between what we do and cool music, like gospel music. They're like, what is it? So your communities are around choirs, which is really fun. But yeah, the gospel is the good news or the message. It's the message about what Christianity is, what God has done, and who God is. That's what that means, the gospel. And the message of Christianity, the good news about Jesus, is that he has defeated all sin, brokenness, death, and evil itself through his own life, his own death, his own resurrection. And because of that incredible gift, of his life, his death, his resurrection for us, he's making everything new, including us. And that's what I usually tell people when I say this is what the gospel is. It's this all-encompassing message about fixing everything that's broken in the world, starting with the core of humanity, but working itself out to making even the heavens and the earth new. So that's the good news.
That's the good news, man. It's so good.
Yeah.
And for your context, you mentioned missional communities. What is a missional community?
Yeah, it's a good question. Missional community is just it's a group of ordinary disciples who are committed to learning to follow Jesus in such a way that they make an impact on the world around them. So the missional community is a group of people that's learning to love and learn how to follow Jesus by loving God increasingly, like giving more and more of their life to God, enjoying the gospel, the fruit of the gospel. It's a community that's also growing in their love for one another, living as family, caring for one another, bearing one another's burdens, knowing one another. And a missional community is a group of people that's also intentionally together loving their neighbors, speaking the gospel, living on mission to those around them. And so it's those three like sort of core commands of the gospel, or that Jesus gives us. A missional community is trying to live those out all together. And we're pretty convinced that a group of people learning to follow Jesus like that makes a drastic impact on their street, on their block, in their neighborhood, their town, city, villa, gated community, whatever it might be. So that's what a missional community is.
Yeah, and missional communities, for your context in your church, you're the equipper of those missional communities, right? You lead the leaders.
Yeah, so we have there's me and another staff member, and we both kind of oversee the equipping and the raising up of these missional community leaders. We have 10 scattered across the west and south side of Los Angeles, and each community has a different collection of leaders, a different kind of vision that their community's growing in, their different mission, and all that good stuff. And so, yeah, I spend a lot of my time coaching those leaders, mentoring them, developing new leaders, that whole thing. It's kind of the lifeblood of our church.
That's awesome. Very cool.
Yeah.
Well, when it comes to, your missional communities being centered in the gospel of loving God, loving each other, and loving neighbors, I think when we talk about church in that way, when we talk about, our communities in that way, I can't help but think of our families. And so for those listening to the podcast of connecting church and home, what we talk about, a big part of who we are at Kingsland is we challenge our parents to be the primary faith trainers. And so everything we do, we want to equip them. We don't want to just say, hey, you're the primary faith trainer, and then good luck. Like, we want to equip them to be able to do that in their homes. And for you and disciple making process, like what does that look like in your context for equipping parents?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that for us, a big piece is through those communities. So our communities have children in them, like ours has 7 children from the ages of 7 weeks old to 8 years old. And I think that one of the best ways to train parents to speak the gospel or live out the implications of the gospel is by demonstrating it. So I think a lot can be done to talk about this is what you need to do. There can be lots of blogs about make sure you do morning devotions, all of that stuff. But for most parents, most disciples, they've never had those spiritual conversations with anyone, or the last time they did, maybe it was when they were in college and they were part of a campus ministry that was really pushing that, or some kind of form of that. And so people really need to see it. And so that's something we try to do in the missional community context as a main way to train people, train parents even to speak the gospel to their kids. So the people around me are seeing how I treat my kids or how I treat the other kids in the community. That's a really, really big piece, as well as for our church and even all our preaching or training. we always try to connect those dots for people, not just how do they share the gospel in their neighborhood or how does the gospel apply in their neighborhood, but also how's the gospel apply to parents. And one of the main things I think is parents need to know their need of the gospel as well. So I think that there's a reality of to be a good parent that's centered around the gospel. A mom or a dad needs to know that they're a son or a daughter of God, and that they're completely dependent. And they're a son and a daughter of God, not because they've done it perfectly and anything like that, but God has chosen to adopt them as sons and daughters through Jesus. And that parents need to know true that like you're not perfect, but Jesus is perfect. And also that every aspect, everything in their life doesn't belong to them, including their children, and your children belong to God, and he's the king, and you're just serving him as a steward. Like all of that deep identity stuff has to come out. And so we try to preach the gospel to parents in the context of parenting, because it's super stressful, exhausting, thankless. We live in a hyper parents need to be perfect culture, because we're all dealing with our past wounds. And so we don't want to give any wounds to our children. And then we think if our children have wounds, then they're never going to grow up and be mature because I have wounds and I'm a mess. And there's a huge like gospel trust issue of like, no, just will Jesus heal our kids' wounds? So, man, yeah, I think that's a big thing.
Wow. Just to unpack that. Wow. Just to, the gospel has to matter to the parents, right? And, what about that parent who feels like they've blown it already, or, they haven't really led their home centered around the gospel? Like, what would you say for them?
Yeah, I think that the hope of the gospel is that, Jesus came to heal all brokenness and sin and evil. And so there's good news there. And then I think there's also like the primary kind of even indicator of if a child grows up to follow Jesus, or one of them at least, is if parents truly believe and orient their lives around the gospel. So like, for example, for my parents, like I knew from a very early age that my parents were focusing their life on Jesus and his mission above all else. Even if I wanted to be like an all-star T-ball or not, like all those decisions were filtered through what is like Jesus calling us to in his mission. And I think that's, so if a parent's been struggling with that, I think one of the first things to ask is like, how is your life completely oriented around Jesus as the King of all kings, including your own life? And then if a child can see that as they grow up, that's one of the main kind of even indicators of if they grow up to follow Jesus.
To follow, I was just thinking as you're talking, the first one of, what do you say to those parents who their kids are the center of their world? Like everything revolves around them. Like this is a culture shift for their home. Like, what would you say for that?
I think those kinds only come out with much prayer and fasting. I think that, gently, there's not one single conversation that's going to help a parent go from their kids the center of the world, of their world, to Jesus is the center. But I do think through like careful and consistent, like talking about the gospel of Jesus and connecting it to like the implications. Like if this is true about Jesus, like if Jesus really did raise from the dead and conquered everything, then maybe we can trust him with our kids, and maybe he is has authority over every decision that we make. I think that's a big piece for people, as well as like this. I think one of the reasons that many parents or just any disciple kind of makes something besides Jesus the center of their world and their decision making is because they kind of view the gospel as just the gateway into heaven, not the thing that is the beginning and the end and the middle of their whole life. And so I think that's a big shift that has to happen for a parent to kind of move that way. And so, but I think there's also just the boldness, something that we tell parents all the time is just like, your life is not about them, and Jesus has them. And so Jesus wants to know, how are you going to steward their lives? Not for them to get into the best college, though that could be super important, but how are you going to steward their lives to know him and follow him?
Wow. So the first one, I mean, it's a hard task to change your culture if your house isn't currently reoriented around the gospel. But then the second thing that you said right there was a lot of this has to do with the discipleship or the following of Jesus personally as a parent, right? Mm-hmm. One thing we say is you can't challenge a parent to disciple their kids if they've never been discipled.
Totally.
So what does that look like in your context of like helping people shift, something that maybe God's working in them and translating that into their kids? Like, does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think in art for here, it looks super chaotic. So just because like what you're saying is so true, like parents haven't been discipled. So like, they're not going to disciple their children. Even just like, basic things like in our culture, it's, you're not supposed to ask people to do hard things. You're not supposed to, no one's supposed to suffer. And so that's how our culture's discipled us. And so a parent thinks the best thing is always the easiest thing, or the thing that causes the least friction, or the thing that gives us the most comfort. And that's how we've been discipled. And so then we parent our kids the same way, like, well, whatever's challenging, we need to remove, or whatever struggle they have, we need to remove. And so, I think for us, it's super messy because we're trying to parent or disciple parents into doing hard things out of faithfulness, obedience, trying to even comfort people in their suffering and allow them to stay in their suffering, not like find the most comfortable way out. And I think that kind of trickles down. But also in the context of like a really wonderful, like a community that loves one another, you end up having really hard conversations where parenting or like lack of discipline or lack of intentionality is really just like the fruit stuff or symptoms of kind of like deeper belief issues, like, for example, like a super harsh parent who's just like riding their kids all the time, like angry and overwhelming. Like you can go to the parent and be like, hey man, I've seen you like really like lose it with your kids. Man, I just think there must be something deeper than that. Like what's going on in your heart? Like, what do you believe? And I think you can walk through and begin, like parents can see like, well, if my kids aren't perfect and well-behaved, I will look bad. I will have, like, people won't respect me.
It goes back to that identity.
Well, right. And it's like, well, what? So your parents have to behave well, then you'll be respected. What does that say, like, about your deepest belief about who God thinks you are? It's like, wow. Well, the only way for God to respect me or think that I'm important is if I do really good things and if I look really important. It's like, oh, well, what does that tell you about who God is? It's like, oh, God's just a person who wants us to see that we do things right and we look good. Like, that's what God's looking for. You're like, oh, but so that's a lie. Yeah. So the truth, though, is God is abounding in love and mercy and grace. And what he's done for you is he sent Jesus to come into the world to find the sick, the broken, the weak, the vulnerable, the messed up, the poor in spirit, those who mourn. And he's looked on you and said, man, you are a screw up. But because of Jesus' death and resurrection, he actually counts to you like righteousness. And the way God sees you is like, this is my child. I'm proud of him. I love him because of who Jesus is. And now you actually get to parent in a completely different way, where the fruit might be grace, compassion, still like strong call to obey. Like it's important to teach our children to obey. But I think that's how that kind of gospel fruit to root stuff works. Yeah. And you can work it the other way of a parent who doesn't disciple at all, or discipline their kids at all. But anyway, that's Yeah.
And you said, you started that off by talking about community and living in community with other parents and the importance. And, we've said it even on this podcast, and we've said it all over, that alone is dangerous. Like, you need to be living in community. And that's messy, right? Like, to be able to go to your brother and say, hey, I notice you're kind of losing it here. What's up with that? Like, how do you, in a world, in our context, where you do want to present yourself with the perfection, or you have this idea, and for someone to call you out, like, how do you get to that level of community for someone to be okay, for me to not just question your parenting style, but even like go beyond that of like, hey, there's something deeper going on that I see. So like, how do you foster that type of community for parents?
Yeah, I think that is like, man, because it's okay to talk about politics, but it's not okay to talk about parenting, right?
Don't get out of my business.
You can talk about it like hypothetically, but not like specifically. Like, and I think it is messy. I think that there has to be like boldness or like courage, and also humility. So like, just anecdote story, like, our community, as I said, has 7 children. One of our times when we were all together, one of my kids, we were in a different family's house. It was really loud and crazy, and we were like, as adults, trying to pray downstairs, but we heard like all this thumping and screaming and crying, and I went up there to see what was happening. And one of the kids, the other kids, it wasn't my biological child, like, was pulled off of the bunk bed and like on the ground, and this other kid was yelling and screaming that my daughter had called him names, and it was like a full-on like chaos. It was bizarre. I took my children downstairs. The prayer time ended. I went to the dad. I was like, hey man, like, this just went down, like, it's pretty messed up. And he's like, well, like, it sounds like, we just need to give it a better shot next time. And I went home and I was like so angry. I was like, my kids were just pulled off of a bunk bed. Like, this is not okay. And if they're not going to discipline their kids, I'm not bringing them back to their house anymore. And so then I called them and I said, hey, we need to have coffee today and talk about our kids. And he was like, okay, cool. And we sat down and I basically kind of unloaded on him. And I was like, man, this is not okay. And he talked through, he was like, well, if we weren't there to see what happened, then, I don't really think we know what we can do. And I was like, man, this is crazy. Like, my kids were like actually hurt. Like, where's the discipline? Like, where's the punishment? And he was like, why do you want them to be punished? And it was this big, huge conflict. And in the end, he's like, so you're saying I'm a bad parent? And I said, yes, you're a bad parent.
You're terrible.
Yeah. And then he was like, oh my gosh. And then a few days later, we were back together and he came up to me and he was like, man, I just don't think that the way that you handled that was really good. And I think it was right, but it was harsh. Also, like, I think you're struggling with just the shame of like your children actually messing up as well, and fear about their safety. And so all of that was like, because we're kind of just committed to one another. But also, like, through that, we became so tight and so close, even in like reconciling that, and even coming to the point of like we had to do a do-over conversation because I think we were both so hot and defensive. Wow. And in that do-over conversation, it was like, no, like, I do love your kids and I do love you as a parent. I do think that you're doing a good job as a parent, but I am kind of calling you up to like, hey, like, your kids do need kind of like immediate consequences, to know and to respect you. And then like, I had to grow and being like, I need to like give more grace. And so anyway, I think that's how it happens.
That's messy. And, I know for a fact families who have left churches because they had kids get into it and didn't reconcile and didn't do that. And so,
right.
It as a church and especially as groups, doing life together, I think there needs to be kind of this conversation, and you can help me phrase this or frame this, but what does the conversation look like as parents of those groups to say, hey, we're in this together. We're not going to be defensive. I need you. My kids need you too. And we're doing this together. Like, how do you even start that conversation? Like, as a group, we call our groups community groups. And I'm just thinking, in a group setting like that, like, where do you begin? You just say, all right, let's go right after it and get messy.
Right. Yeah. And I think that really is kind of the mess of it. I think just a few like kind of principles around it is to say like, hey, like we love this community and we want it to grow and be healthy. And so there's some stuff happening and we just want to bring it to the light, like, hey, like, let's just put it on the table and see like what's going on. And let's kind of like talk through this. And then I think there's, usually I think because we're in a pretty conflict averse society, conflict equals bad, equals the death of relationship. And so I think it does require some level of maturity of like someone in that group has to say, no matter what, we're not bailing because we had a fight, that kind of determination, kind of thing. But then I think, just saying like, hey, so how are we feeling about kids and what's happening, and how, and like, let's just be gracious about it and talk through and like, what do we, what does the future need to look like? But also like, how can we care and love and support one another? How can we make it normal for us to say, we don't really know what we're doing about parenting? Like, we really don't know what we're doing. And I think that's like the beginning is to say like, because I think every parent wants to portray that they're like, they've got it all under control. And it's like, we're not going to be a community if everyone thinks they have to be under control. Yeah. And it's like, we need to say straight up, like, I don't know what to do with my kids. Can you help me? Yeah. Yeah. And it's just so good. So we're out of time, but I always ask this last question for everybody that I interview. What is one thing? So if a parent is just hearing this, they've gone through all this stuff, and maybe they're overwhelmed with like, man, the gospel is so much richer than what I give it credit for, or whatever they're getting out of our last few moments. I always want to ask, like, what is one thing, just one practical application, something that a parent can do right now, today, to reorient their lives around the gospel or just to disciple their kids? Like, what's one piece of advice that every parent can do today? It's a good question. Just one thing.
You can have multiple, but just...
I think that the one thing that makes like a powerful difference just in my own life is taking 5 or 10 minutes of just quiet, whether that means getting up before everyone or when you drop the kids off of school, or everyone can make 5 to 10 minutes of quiet and just like trying to listen to God about like who he says you are. And at times I've written that like Psalms and on like little index card, and I put it in my pocket so I can look at it, or just a statement about the gospel, and just ask God to like remind me of that truth. And then ask God for the power to be a father who is a son of God. And I think that just that kind of short listening prayer makes a radical difference. Wow. So
that's huge. Man. So good. Well, Brad, thank you. You're incredible, man. If you're listening, you want more information from Brad, what's the best spot they can do? Just Google, or
yeah, totally. You can you can just Google Brad Watson. There's a hockey player and a like romance novelist. But I think if you go to saturatetheworld.com, It's a long title, but saturatetheworld.com. You can find out a lot. Also, I have a website called bradawatson.com. And then lastly, too, I have written a book called The Gospel Basics for Kids. It's a curriculum that kind of outlines like what is the gospel, how do we live, who are we, like identity and stuff. And actually included within all of it is a devotional each week just for like the parent or a teacher. So a lot of people go through it in their home. A lot of people go through it in their communities. So anyway, that's probably a super relevant resource.
Oh, yeah. We should have been talking about that. Next time, we'll talk about that.
No, it's great.
Yeah, I love it, man. And we'll have all those resources, everything to the description here. And Brad, thank you so much.
No problem. Thanks, Bobby.
Thanks for listening to the Empowered Homes podcast. For more content and information to connect church and home, please visit empoweredhomes.org.